was ordained in 1968, shortly before this parish was beginning to be built and to blossom. And as the Redemptorists were so taken up with Vatican II that's the spirit in which they wanted this parish to live and to breathe. And we've been trying to do that ever since here. For me, it was a time of passing on what we had learned in the seminary, because few of our priests before us had really had the opportunity to study Vatican II. So they didn't understand necessarily everything that we were doing, not like we understood it because we were we were well trained. They tell the story of the woman who went into confession and discovered that it was face to face. And she said, "Oh my God," she said, I'm a little nervous about this. And the priest says, "My first time too." It's a wonderful time. And one of the things I was trying to experiment with was, what kind of readings could we use, say at baptism, that would help us understand, not just the child wouldn't be understanding this, but certainly adults. What would I want them to hear about this baptism? Where is it taking us to? Is it simply only a ticket to heaven, or is it the beginning of a ministry in the world? And strangely, I picked as one of the readings I would like to use at baptism, today's reading from Isaiah, Old Testament. We're talking about New Testament baptism, but this thing really appealed to me because in the same time on those days, in the 60s, we were very much caught up in studying social justice. And it's interesting that after all we've been through these last few weeks, that Archbishop Carlson said in his homily the other day that he promises to reopen an office that has been closed in our diocese for decades. And it used to be a very important office, and it's called the Office of Human Rights. And so maybe we will be hearing a bit more about that. But here's what Isaiah says to us. You heard it earlier. It's called true fasting. Is this the manner of fasting I wish? The keeping of a day of penance. That a man bow his head like a reed and lie in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call this a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? This is the fasting I wish. Release those bound unjustly. Untie the thongs of the yoke. Setting free the oppressed, sharing your bread with the hungry, sheltering the oppressed and the homeless, clothing the naked when you see them, and not turning your back on your own. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your wound shall quickly be healed. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, "Here I am." If you remove from your midst oppression, false accusation, malicious speech, if you bestow the bread on the hungry and satisfy the afflicted, then the light will shine in your darkness. He will renew your strength, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. There's a slight baptismal image there with that sense of water. And the reason I think readings like this are so important is because I'm kind of helpless sometimes helping people who come to me and say, somebody told me that everybody comes into this world with a purpose. God's got a purpose for everybody. And I can't figure out what God's purpose for me is. Can you help me? No, I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue. Because I don't believe that. I don't believe that's so efficient. That's so duty-bound. It's like, okay, everybody's got to play a part in this role. Well, of course we do. Or some people will say, I wonder what God's plan for me is tomorrow. As far as I know, I don't think he has one. I think he's given you free will. He's probably curious about what you're going to do tomorrow. But we get this sense that ties us in knots What is God's plan for me? Now, did God say in the Bible somewhere, I have plans for you? Yes, he said it to the Israel nation, to the nation. But we've heard it individually, thinking, oh, God's got plans for me. I wonder what they are, and how will I find out? I have to try to help people relax. Relax. If you want to know what God's plan is for all of us, read Isaiah. Imagine, I say to myself, if I could get up every morning and read just that passage and ask myself, am I partaking in what God has called us to be? And that's why in Colossians we hear an echo of the same one. Paul tells us what we are to wear while we're trying to live out God's life. Because you are God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with mercy, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. Forgive whatever grievances you have against one another. Boy, wouldn't that change the face of the world? Over all these virtues, which bind the rest together and makes them perfect, put on love. Christ's peace must reign in your hearts. The other translation we heard this morning was, and I love this, let God's peace control your hearts. Now, that's the only time I hear a word about God controlling something, and it's our hearts. But God doesn't control it and manipulate it. He said, may the peace of Christ in our hearts be that which controls our hearts. That would keep us from it would keep us from saying a lot of things. Christ's peace must reign there. Dedicate yourself to being thankful. Let the word of Christ, rich as it is, dwell in you in wisdom made perfect. And of course, the gospel this morning is just so right to the point. When those Pharisees wanted to trick Jesus or test him on what he knew and said, what's the greatest law in all of our laws? And they had like 600 and something laws. They're not talking 10 commandments. They're talking all the laws of the Jews. Which one of those 600 plus is the first and best? Love God with all that you are. Your heart, your mind, your spirit. And the second one is just like the first one. Love your neighbors yourself. Of course, sometimes we have to admit that we may be having trouble loving ourselves. There's some of us that should not dare to love our neighbor as ourselves because we can really be picking on ourselves a lot and something sad about ourselves. But if we could only discover we're beloved by God, then maybe we'd be freer to pass that on. St. Louis must have been a wonderful man. He was made king very early in his life. And down through the years, he created quite a family, had 11 children. And he was in Forest Park, he's on a horse with the sword. That's the thing he did worse in his life. He wasn't very good at that, but he was gone one time 7 years on the Crusades. But his real gift was for his heart for the poor, for fairness and justice. If he caught anybody in his control, if any of his barons or anybody serving him was caught hurting someone else, they were in for trouble. If he found any of them practicing usury is taking an interest on a loan. It's the way of life today. But in those days in the church, it was forbidden because you shouldn't be adding more struggle to someone's life whom you've just tried to help by a loan. He opened a monastery. He built Sainte-Chapelle, a beautiful chapel church, to hold the crown of thorns that he brought back from a crusade. After that, somebody else stole them. But that's what he wanted. He wanted that kind of thing. He opened up the Sorbonne, a wonderful university. He took care of lepers. And one day he heard that one of his barons had beat up or killed 3 children who dared to enter his property and try to play with or shoot the rabbits on his property. And so that wealthy man set out to kill those children. And when Lewis heard that, he was shocked. He called the man in and he said, "What were you thinking?" He said, "Well, it was my property and they were on my property." He said, "I'm going to have you tried, not by your friends, not by your companions. You're going to be tried by the people of this kingdom." And the people found the man guilty and sentenced him to death. But Lewis wouldn't allow it. He gave him just a very high fine to pay that would hurt his riches. This is the Lewis after whom our city is named, our archdiocese is named. And our archdiocese and our city and our county have been through a lot this week, and I don't need to repeat it. If you haven't read the headlines, you're not breathing. It's been all over. It was good to open the St. Louis Review and see where our priests were fitting into that. One priest is the chaplain to the police, so he was standing with the police. Another one was working often with the poor, and he was standing holding one of the neighbors from the neighborhood. And another one was marching through a crowd in prayer, and his eyes were shut. And I thought those were 3 wonderful pictures of how the diocese and its priests tried to get in and be some kind of instrument of peace. So what shall we do for Lewis this day? We've seen the birthday cakes all over the place celebrating the 250th anniversary of the city of St. Louis. It's the 800th anniversary of Lewis's birth. So what shall we do? Sing happy birthday? No. Let's do what Lewis would do. Let's go to the altar singing, "Holy, holy, holy." And let us share in the same meal that he loved, that Eucharist, that was so much part of his life, going to Mass twice a day. This was a Lewis in love with his faith, passing it on to his children. Let us eat of the same meal this day. Let us become what we eat, so that the Christ in whom we believe will be within our hearts, controlling our hearts with his peace.